right, Victoria, home of a potato cake. Not a potato scallop, not a potato fritter. Potato cake's the right terminology down here.
Pot, not a schooner.
That too.
Hook turns. Just thought I'd add mine in.
Now that's contentious. Okay, Victoria, since we're all down in Victoria here, I'm going to keep saying we. We have 7 stars. We did bring that in, and we have 7 stars average for apartments with 6-star minimum. Our ads and alts are a little bit different, which we'll come to in a moment. We have the whole of home as per the NCC. What we lost was rainwater tanks and solar hot water services, which we had previously in. We had a choice of 6 stars with either a rainwater tank or a solar hot water. Solar hot water got rolled into whole of home, and water tanks just gone.
But they go in the plumbing code, did they?
Look, that's a real rabbit hole if you want to try and chase it down. So H6 something talks about having the water tanks aren't gone for the Victoria rules to look at the Volume 3 NCC. Volume 3 says to look at the Victoria Building Act. Victoria Building Act doesn't really, it's all over the place. Building Act doesn't really say anything, so you go to the Plumbing Act and it just talks about if you do rainwater tanks, then you have to have the 2,000 litres, the 50 square metres catchment that we had previously. But it's only if you do water tanks. So it's parts of the old regs are there, but yeah, it just sort of points you all over the place with no real consistency. The practice note EE05, which was the transitional arrangements, that one is the most clear that said that the water tanks are gone as part of the transitional arrangements. Doesn't make it clear that it's gone permanently, just transitionally. But there's nothing to say it ever came back. So,
Andrew, what should maybe an assessor, if they want to cover off on the rainwater tanks, if they see that part of the scope of their work or their service that they're offering, is there something that they maybe could consider adding to their report in order to cover off on the rainwater tanks?
No. It doesn't form any part of the
Bastard.
oh my god.
Okay. It's just gone. Oh man, this one's crazy tonight. Seriously.
Maybe if it's required by the relevant building surveyor.
No.
No, it doesn't form any part of NatHERS, so there's no requirement under an energy rating to mention a rainwater tank. And because it's not part of the elemental provisions, same. So for an assessor, no, it holds no relevance. But then it never really did previously either, because it was the 6-star requirement was the requirement. Another part of the NCC said plus a rainwater tank or solar hot water service. So it was never part of an energy rating, but we usually coupled them together anyway.
Yeah, it was really just a question that the building surveyor would ask, which one do you want to do?
Yep.
You pick one, and then you'd be bound by that. But it was nothing that the energy rater really had to do other than, like you said, we would get plenty of questions about it, so we ended up just putting it in our notes at the bottom of our energy reports.
More of a connection maybe back to a DTS elemental.
Yeah.
Where you would cover all of the parts.
Yeah.
You're just making sure that you're covering that
Correct.
part.
You would include it, or you would mention it, but there was, again, it didn't have a direct correlation to the energy side of it. It was a water saving feature, not an energy feature, so it was separate but alongside.
Does that give us a nice segue into New South Wales?
Not really, because do you want to talk adds and odds in Victoria?
No. Okay, Andrew, tell us about alterations and additions in Victoria.
Ryan, do you want to deal with EEO
Yeah, I can.
04?
All right, I'll
You
deal
love
with EE04. Hang on a second, but before we do that,
No,
didn't you have a
EE04.
EE04?
No, not E04.
What do you mean?
04. It's a 0. It's not an O.
Well,
No, it's
my
a
phone
0.
number. It's funny when I say my phone number, I go 0, and then I also do O.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
So you know that Tony Isaacs and I worked on this, right?
And that's what I was going to say.
There was a conscious point, I think, in the conversation where we actually called it EE04 and we changed to EE04.
All right. I'm going to refer to this as EE04. So,
Can we put that in the overlay and the title and the bottom?
yeah, just make sure it's a 0. Yep.
With a
So there's two main methods of compliance in EE04 when using NatHERS software. You've got the two-house energy rating method, which I'll cover off in a minute, and you've also got the rating the single house method, and that's predominantly the one that we actually use because of changes that were made in the formula for the two-house energy rating method. Now, when you rate only one house, you still have to do 2 energy ratings. So don't get me wrong, there's still 2 energy ratings that need to be done. But if you rate the one house, you are rating the renovated house as if it is being constructed as new to 7 stars today. So if it might be, 50% extended, 50% existing, but you would be rating it as a 7-star house as if it was going to be constructed right now.
Do I have to build it at 7 stars?
No, you don't, but that's the second energy report that you need to do. So you can ask the building surveyor for dispensation under Regulation 233 for partial compliance for the existing part of that house. Now, what that will do is obviously absolve you for putting those insulation and glazing upgrades to the existing part of the house if it does not form part of the scope of the renovation itself. Also, of the understanding that when you do this method, you also need to put it together as a performance solution to A2G2, which we'll cover off probably on a different episode. So this methodology has to be a performance solution. You do an energy report on the house as if it was being built brand new today, and then you would do a second certified energy report with all of those upgrades applied to the new part of the house, but not in the areas that don't form part of the renovation itself. Now, as a carrot or a justification for the building surveyor to apply that Reg 233 partial compliance, we generally will insulate the ceiling of the existing house. It's a pitch roof, it's easy to get into, it's just giving them something. And also, from an occupier point of view, I would 100% do that anyway. I'd even insulate under the floor if it was a timber subfloor and it was easy to get into. Obviously, pulling off external wall line-ends and internal wall line-ends and things like that, insulating walls, again, it's a very difficult task if it wasn't part of the scope. So all of those things are being negated, and you might end up with something like a 3-star energy rating or a 4-star energy rating or something like that. And that would be the certified document. I'd still put the theoretical preliminary energy report document in the documentation set, and then I would certify the real energy rating, which is the one with these dispensations applied. So at least the owner of the house knows what their true energy rating is, and there's no confusion with them thinking that they've actually got a 7-star house when they actually don't. Yep. Now, reverting back to that 2-house energy rating method, which is what probably most energy reports of renovations and extensions in Victoria were being done in NCC 2019. So the changes with that, there's been a little bit of manipulation with the formula. One of the big things that we saw was the change where it's mandatory now to have R2.5 insulation in the existing ceiling. Now, what that effectively has done is it's brought the energy rating of the existing house up quite high. So the differential when running that through the formula now for the final energy report, so the second energy report once the house is complete, the differential now is too close, and it's harder to bring that complete house up to the energy rating required based on putting it through the formula. So it's not just SRN in that formula changing from 6 to 7. There are some other requirements that change as well. So from my opinion, I don't think that's a viable method anymore. Then obviously you have your standard elemental deemed to satisfy, which is only applied to the new part of the house. So you can obviously upgrade your wall insulation, your ceiling insulation, your window specification using the glazing calculator for the new part of the house. Don't have to apply that obviously again under Reg 233. There are some things that you can actually do with that glazing calculator where you can apply that specification throughout all the windows in the house, and that potentially could give you an easier to comply with window specification. That you can do that as well with renovation extension. And again, under Reg 233, you don't actually have to do that. But that's probably the only somewhat trade-off mechanism that you can do with elemental, and it's more just a process item more than anything. So Andrew, then what are your thoughts with regards to the minimum R2.5 in the existing ceiling?
I reckon that's fair. There aren't too many houses that don't have some level of insulation on the ceiling. There have been so many programs over the last few decades of getting insulation in. Gas and Fuel ran a program back in the 80s, I think it was, to get R2 on ceilings. Insulation in Victoria in the VBR, I think it was, so predating NCC, had requirements. So they came in 1990. So certainly everything after that had at least R2 on the ceiling. We've had the Pink Bat scheme for good or bad, but it was a scheme that got insulation onto ceilings. So I don't have a problem putting R2.5 on the existing ceiling. And invariably, every time I asked a client the question, do you know if you've got insulation? We don't know. We haven't looked up in there. So, they don't even know what's there to be able to give you any clue. So
that was the good part about the NCC 2019 practice note EE04, the fact that you could choose worst case scenario if nobody knew, which would make the deviation from old to new quite dramatic, which helped with those formulas. If you took worst case scenario and assumed there was no insulation in the ceiling. So it sort of threw that out the window and made it more difficult to comply using that two-house energy rating method. In my opinion, having done lots of them.
If you're going that way to start with, ever since that calculation came in, I always had the attitude that there's usually insulation in there. So if the client could tell me we have no insulation, I've been up in the roof, I know that there's none, then I would apply 0. If they didn't know, I always assumed R2. And that was an assumption of R2 having degraded from 2.5 when it was first installed because of all these historic programs.
Yeah. I think out of all of the building elements you're going to get, you're most likely to find that there's some ceiling insulation. It's definitely the easiest to do.
Yeah, and that's
one of the most
carrot.
cost effective. It's going to give you the biggest probably bang for your buck. Underfloor's good, as you mentioned earlier, but little bit more difficult if you're not ripping up the floorboards. Walls are incredibly difficult. Probably windows are actually, I would say, is the next easiest after ceiling insulation. So to upgrade the windows. I mean, in an existing build, to try and do that for the walls can be quite invasive. You're removing skirtings and architraves and cornices and pressed metal ceilings and a whole lot of things, right? It's whereas I feel like probably between those, actually, ceiling and then probably windows, you can improve the performance of the windows.
Funnily enough, what you were saying before about you were doing a lot of calculations before, I was always not doing the calculations because I would find it hard having assumed that there was insulation on the ceiling.
Yes.
So now that
Yes.
that requirement is there,
Yeah.
you're finding it hard for exactly the same reason. So I just simply predated where we're at the moment.
That's actually quite interesting, actually. So our calculations for the two-house formula are always automated. So all the volumes, all the areas, all of that type of stuff, it was all automated straight out of the NatHERS software. So that's why we did that, because it was quite easy and we were seeing good results all of the time, rather than trying to get the house to 6 stars and then ask for dispensation under Reg 233. But again, having done the same thing, adjusting the formula based on the new practice note, we found that the results were a cheaper construction cost to try and get it all to 7 stars and then get dispensation. So again, the reverse of what you were doing, and the reverse of what we were doing.
Come on, I've got to ask this question. You were doing volume calculations based on the NatHERS, but if memory serves me correct, Andrew, maybe you can fill in the missing gaps here. Doing the volume calculations was just purely NatHERS would have actually been a bit tricky, because the volume calculation was a little bit more complex than just the sort of zone itself.
Oh, it's the internal walls, internal area multiplied by ceiling height.
You're thinking what Kenneth is doing in the background. Brian's talking about the data that comes out on the diagnostic report, where you could just simply take the areas and then multiply them by the ceiling height.
Okay.
It's one way of doing it. But I mean, again, I was a little bit different in the way I did them, but that was the thing. There was no one way to achieve the outcome.
Yep.
But as long as you were consistent on what you did on this one and you did it on this one, you're going to get the same result.
Yep.
Oh, that's,
So if
that's
you-
true, because they're relative. Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
that's right.
Yeah,
Because
I
it
think
was a
that's probably the
comparable,
key. Yeah.
comparable report.
Yeah.
Correct.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
But even now we still argue about which is the right way to interpret the practice note.
Yeah.
And it drives us batty a lot of the time.
I think a deep dive into that one practice note at some point in time would be worthwhile.
We could probably spend an entire session talking about that one.
Well,
and
yeah.
also probably talking a little bit about our own experiences with, what methods we prefer. Pretty sure that we probably prefer the same.
Yeah, look, I've got
Option.
lots of stories on this one. But
Whereas you and I have argued repeatedly on interpretation. You say it's got to be this way. I say it's got to be this way.
that is correct. Okay, so let's move on to H6P2 in EE04. For renovations extensions, now there is a paragraph in that practice note that says any renovation and extension in Victoria must have a minimum of a 3 kilowatt solar PV system, unless there physically is not enough room on the roof. I do wonder why that was in there. Now, again, we put the documentation together as a performance solution. We run it through the ABCB whole of home calculator, and we can mitigate some of that requirement of 3 kilowatts. Now, I can go through all those requirements and so on, but we'll probably again leave that for another day for a deep dive. But any thoughts on why the backstop was 3 kilowatts?
No.
No.
To be honest, I'd sort of forgotten that was there.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a worry.
And Brian, thanks for the reminder. Probably the majority of the work that I do probably falls a little bit into the new homes as opposed to the alterations and additions. But If I'm honest, I think that there was just a period there where there was just so much uncertainty that it sort of almost felt dangerous to sort of do alterations and additions unless you were fully across the top of it, unless you really understood it, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if there's probably not a lot of people listening that used to do a lot of alterations and additions, maybe even the way back in the PN55, that sort of didn't quite make the transition, and felt that taking on alteration addition work was a bit difficult, So I'm not surprised. And this document, or these two documents, they have had a history, haven't they? They've sort of, PN55 was
2010.
Yeah, and had a few iterations. It got better.
Yeah, around 2018.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then I'd like to think that it got better again when it split to E03 and 4.
Yeah, I think iteratively it got better every single time.
Yeah.
There were a lot of issues to begin with.
But like a lot of things, I think the devil is quite often in the detail, isn't it? And in the interpretation. And how we read things and how we interpret things can be different. And I think I'd actually enjoy probably a deep dive into that. Yeah. But
yeah, there's interpretations again with regards to Reg 233, less than 25% extension. Do you need to do whole of home? Don't you need to do whole of home? Should you put solar on? Shouldn't
that's
you?
right.
So
actually,
there are those
whole of
things
home,
as well.
no whole of home, and
yep.
Probably be great to get a Victorian RBS in, I think, for maybe that session as well. I think that could be interesting to get there.
I'm just thinking, do you want to use the one that I talk to, or the one that Brian talks to, or
that's
or do we have to get a few in?
Yeah, let's get a few in, and they can all argue it out. It's
yeah. So yeah. Maybe we draw a line in the sand for Victoria.
Yeah, I think so. It does get very complicated. All right, moving on to ACT.
I believe the ACT moved to NCC 2022 in 15th of January 2024. Does that sound about right?
It was actually earlier. It was earlier than No, you're right. It was January. It was just after the Christmas break. It was after New South Wales, but before Victoria. So you're right. It was. But
it came in on a weird date.
Yeah, it was odd.
A little bit different.
It was so that you could get over the Christmas break and then start into it afterwards.
Right. And so they adopted the NCC 2022 energy...
No variations.
Efficiency, yep, and livable housing.
Correct.
They did the whole lot, right?
Correct.
Yep.
For all building classes. Yep. Equivalent to 7 stars.
Equivalent to 7 stars.
That's
Singular climate zone.
One climate
24.
zone.
One climate zone.
Yep.
And easier, well, in my opinion, ACT is ever so slightly easier to comply than Victoria.
Okay.
Don't know why, but it is.
Colder climate, more insulation. It's fairly straightforward. You haven't got a cooling load as much. I'm not saying they don't get hot. They do.
Yeah, I mean, you could be right. It could be a cooling load issue in summer.
So one extra requirement in the ACT, that the formal evidence for energy efficiency, like a certificate or some sort of statement or something, I believe that has to be issued by a licensed building assessor. So that's a requirement.
What was that one called?
It's a caller license. Yep.
See, I learn something new every day. I did not know that.
Yeah. So in the ACT, you need a caller license, which effectively is just like it's like a construction occupation license, which is issued under the Construction Occupations Licensing Act. Caller.
Okay. That does not make sense.
Yeah, it's just a sort of like, effectively, it's just a license to sort of regulate practitioners. And that's required not just for energy efficiency, that's also required for building and plumbing and electrical work and a whole range of other sort of disciplines. Just making sure that you're complying with the probably safety and quality standards.
Interesting.
Okay. So the only real other difference in ACT is they have NatHERS for on sale and lease of a existing home. So the precursor to the current transition to existing homes, everything coming under the same umbrella as scorecard and ACT actors.
Did they need a call license?
Yes, I believe so.
I think they do.
You need to be registered as
okay.
I think it's class 1 or class 2, depending what you do and how you do it.
Using first rate 4.
Yes.
Hey, can you use BERS, or does it have to be first rate 4?
I think for actors it's first rate 4.
Right. So,
Do you know anybody who has a copy of First Rate 4?
oh, yeah, could be. Well, we both do, don't we, Andrew?
We do.
Yeah, you know.
And on the black market, that's worth how much money?
Oh, it's gold. Absolute
Yeah.
gold.
Do you know what's interesting though? There is actually no training available in First Rate 4.
Yeah, well, wouldn't surprise me.
Well,
I mean, you've got
the manual's about 80 pages, if that. Probably not that. If you can't figure out first rate 4 from that, you're in trouble.
A lot of people probably wouldn't have even have access to a manual.
Well, if you have the software, it was included on the CD.
Yeah.
So
if people could
you
even
had
get the CD or the software. Yeah.
Yes.
I just remember all the scale rulers and drawing on plans and measuring everything up and typing it into the... Gee, it was a bit like Accurate Enterprise, really.
Oh, them fighting words.
It was... oh, yeah, that's not good, is it?
Yeah, technically it was. Like when... this getting way off topic,
Yeah.
but I did a day's training on NatHERS software. This was before second generation software. So what was the precursor to Accurate was called NatHERS. We did that with quite a lot of people from SV at the time. And yeah, in many ways there were similarities. You had to type in, not to the extent of Accurate, but you still had to put in all your data, your wall lengths, heights, the offset to this window and how far this window was from that corner and the eave and, it was before a graphical interface that we have now.
Yeah.
So that was a one-day course?
Yeah, it was just to show it, I think,
Right.
more than anything. And
So then the RBTPA course was 2 days with the software. So we went from 1 day
Yes.
to 2 days.
That's the one I remember, the 2-day course.
The 2 day. That was First Rate 5.
Yeah. No, that was First Rate 4 as well. It was a
4?
2-day course, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
no, the NatHERS Generation 1 software.
Pre that. Yeah, okay.
That was just a 1 day show off.
Right, okay.
You had the training course for First Rate 3 in my case,
Yeah.
and 4 for others, and then second generation came in, which became 2 days software plus 2 days theory.
Oh, that's right. That was the RBTPA.
So that became the 4-day course before transitioning to the Cert 4
the Cert
course,
4.
before transitioning to the next Cert 4 course.
And on it goes.
So, Andrew, you started First Rate 3. Is that right?
3. Yeah,
Yeah.
3.
And Brian?
And then 3.5.
4.
Yeah.
4.
Yeah. And I joined with 5. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I sort of wish I'd joined the industry a little bit earlier and, may have gone on that journey. I mean, I think I made up for it in becoming accredited in all the 4 tools, but I sort of missed the early tools.
Matthew, you certainly made up for it. Don't stress about that.
Look, you didn't miss it. Gen 1 was a completely different tool to Gen 2. When we went to first rate 5 and you had this graphical data, this graphical interface, and you drew all the zones, and it was, wow, look at what you can do. Yeah. Look at the data that comes out of it. Where Gen 1, as Brian said, you get your ruler. How long is this wall? It's 6 metres. I'm going to type in 6 metres. That was your data. You didn't do internal. You didn't look at the room configurations or any of that sort of thing. So it was, incredibly simple.
It makes you wonder how the Cheneth engine interpreted all of that data when it wasn't the graphical interface that we use now.
I'm just thinking, did it even have a Cheneth engine? Or was it a different engine back then?
No, I'm pretty sure it was still Cheneth engine. It was just a different version.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
right, so we're good for ACT?
Yeah. Let's get on to the last one of New South Wales. I don't do any work in New South Wales. I avoid it. So I'm not going to say anything here.
All right, so from memory, New South Wales was the first one to adopt NCC 2022, and I'm pretty certain that was 1st of October 2023. And because obviously they use BASIX, which is a different system, it was contracts had to be signed prior to 1st of October 2023, and then those BASIX certificates only last 3 months. So if you didn't apply for your DA within that 3 months, then you would have to complete a new BASIX certificate. And this is when, obviously, with that transition of BASIX and the software, like the New South Wales portal being down all the time and things going wrong and calculations not working and so on, there was a lot of trouble that was going on in that period of time. And there was absolutely no dispensation. If your BASIX certificate ran out in 3 months, you would simply have to do an NCC 2022 version of the house. Now, you can imagine how that went down when you were doing BASIX report and you were trying to comply with that thermal performance protocol, and you only had to achieve a certain heating load and a certain cooling load, and then suddenly you had to achieve 7 stars when you were doing energy reports, and they could have been 4.5 stars, 5 stars, and then suddenly you had to jump up 2 stars. That's a pretty hard pill to swallow for anybody, I think. So all those things were happening at that point in time around October of 2023. So understanding the changes that were happening in BASIX. Now, obviously, the BASIX software itself, or so the portal itself, the stringency increased. You also had this total load cap that you needed to comply with now, which you didn't need to do. So that total load cap, so it's the exact same megajoules that represent 7 stars. And
so there wasn't a cap before?
No, it's just you had to comply with the individual heating load and the individual cooling load. And if you knew how to do your energy reports succinctly, properly, you could, I don't want to say game it, but you could work out exactly what the lowest insulation and glazing that you could put in to meet that heating and cooling load cap.
There was a cap.
For heating and cooling, not the total load. So the total load is the one that represents the star value. So you could game these to the point where you could get away with 4.5 stars, something like that, as long as you met that heating and cooling load cap. So obviously a transition NCC 22 with the total load, suddenly it jumps all the way up to 7 stars. That's a big bridge. Like that's
So you want to share with us maybe some of those star ratings that you were getting NCC 2022 when you were meeting the heating and cooling load caps? What were some of those star ratings that you were seeing?
4.2, 4.4, and that's why, with this CSIRO portals and all of that type of stuff, where they take the data, and a lot of it's BERS data that they'll be using, they're quite low, and that's all because of the old BASIX requirements. So some of that
I didn't
data
realise
really,
they were as down as low as 4.2.
Well,
I heard sort of 4.7, 4.8.
Let me make it worse. Let me really make it worse. All right. So there's carve-outs. So in NCC 2022 for NatHERS climate zones, in New South Wales, NatHERS climate zones 9, 10 and 11, you still do not have a total load cap. It's still a heating and cooling load only. Granted, it's become a little more stringent, but not very stringent. Very recently, well, we've done quite a few, but very recently I've seen one at 4.5 stars, and it still complies with NCC 2022. Single glazed windows, very limited insulation, still complies. So I understand why. Given that you're higher up in the state, you're bordering on Queensland. Queensland does have the 1-star credit. You don't have the 1-star credit in New South Wales. Similar climate zones that you're dealing with. Big double-storey house would be quite hard to achieve 7 stars. Not impossible, but just difficult. So I understand why they have done what they've done, but it just shows that you can still get projects through in certain climate zones in New South Wales well under 7 stars, well under 6 stars even. So it is reasonably common.
So we moved to 7 stars. We got the heating and cooling load caps. What about whole of home for New South Wales?
Well, obviously you don't have that performance requirement H6P2 being whole of home because you've got the other requirements within the BASIX portal that you need to comply with. Now, some of those items have also changed. Now, these are things like, again, water tanks, where we're talking about the star rating, the efficiency of shower heads, tap fittings, toilets, things like that. You've got to calculate things like garden area and rainwater tanks with respect to the area of your plantings around the house, the property itself. So,
and that's always been there?
That's always been there, and I think it's pretty much a prelude to whole of home in the rest of the states. I think that's fair to say. It's quite similar.
Well, it's very ESD type arrangement, like some of the states have ESD, Victoria included. I think there's something over in WA under their planning scheme along those lines. So, the planning's looking at more in terms of efficiencies in multiple areas. So BASIX comes in early before all of that, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Now, that's if you're using the NatHERS method for compliance for the thermal performance protocol, but there is a DIY method that you can do as well, which is it is more similar to an elemental deemed to satisfy, where you calculate the orientation of the windows, the height, the width, shading and all of those types of things. But what we're finding is that, again, because of NatHERS offset facilities that are available, it's still easier to comply with NatHERS rather than doing DIY.
But there's also limitations with the DIY, like size of the house and things like that, isn't there?
There is limitations, and what the other thing that you can do within BASIX is you can actually do renovation and extensions as well.
Okay. Third option of passive house?
Yeah, that's a new requirement for New South Wales only. Now, as I don't do passive house, or the company itself doesn't do passive house, I'm not fully over that. Do either of you guys know more than me? Because I do know that is a possibility to do passive house and gain compliance.
Yeah, it's just another regulatory compliant pathway that's accepted in New South Wales, and I believe passive house advocates are trying to, get that particular pathway adopted in other states and territories as well. So I would have thought probably out of all of those, maybe Victoria would be suitable for that, especially given our sort of climate zone. And historically, Victoria's been quite progressive on energy efficiency. So I was a little bit surprised, to be honest, to see New South Wales move on that before Victoria. So we'll see.
Well, they're moving on established houses before Victoria,
right.
So
and
maybe they're leading charge.
In a way, if you actually sort of I've been running through a few of those things that you were saying that that the BASIX tool, online tool, covers. It's actually got a little bit more detail. It's got more depth, a little bit more rigor almost than the whole of home has in the NatHERS software. So we were talking earlier about, what happened to the rainwater tanks. they're not picked up in whole of home, but they are still picked up in BASIX. So,
Yeah, well, now for Victoria, it only comes in as a planning requirement.
yeah. Okay, so that runs out a tour around Australia, is it?
Yeah, I'm tired. This was a long trip.
So you don't
How many
want to,
kilometres was that?
you don't want to discuss, I don't know, Christmas Island.
No, I don't know anything about Christmas Island.
Norfolk Island.
No, none of the islands, thank you. That wraps up this episode of The Rating Room. Thanks for joining myself, Matthew and Andrew as we uncovered another corner of the NatHERS world. Your thoughts, questions and insights are incredibly important to us. This podcast is as much about the broader industry conversation as it is about our personal thoughts and discussions. So jump on the NatHERS Assessor Facebook page, share your perspective and leave a comment below the video. We'd love to hear what you think and what topics you'd like us to cover next. So until next time, keep rating.